Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Summit podcast. I'm Greg Javer. This is the first podcast I think I've done in 2022, and it's already the third week of April. That's not good. Not good. Kind of got off track a little bit. In fact, I think it's about number 24. I think we did maybe 23 or 24 podcasts in 2011, so I was very happy with that. Truthfully, I also needed to take a little bit of a hiatus. I did not stop researching Ed Wood by any means, but Joe Blevins was engaged in the first few months of the year in every day overviewing, reviewing a different story in a book that got published. I think it came out in December, just late last year, when the topic is sex, a massive collection of something like 88 of Ed's articles that appeared in sex magazines in the mostly late 1960s, early 1970s. So I want to highly recommend that book, obviously, and kudos to Bob Blackburn for collecting all of those Pendulum and Calga magazines to be able to put that book together, as well as the two predecessor books, Blood Splatters Quickly and Angora Fever, which collected his short fiction from the same milieu of magazines. So I recommend all those books if you want to read real deal Ed Wood. A lot of people this is what I want to talk about today, actually. A lot of people might not want to go there in terms of the content. It can be quite graphic at times. Even you could use the word, I think, fairly pornographic. So that's what I want to talk about today. You're like, no, not again, right? Truthfully, and that's how some people feel. No, not again. That's kind of partly what I want to talk about. But I'm here by myself today. I just got out of work a little bit ago. I had a very delicious pork chop for dinner. It was one of the best pork chops I think I've ever had. So I'm unwinding now. I normally don't smoke on the podcast when I have other guests on. It's a bad habit. And if you don't smoke, don't start. And if you drink in moderation. Those are both of my additional recommendations, in addition to recommending that you read more Ed Wood pornography. So yes, I'm a fount of family values, right? For sure. And that's I think a good spinoff point. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Ed, of course, worked a great deal in pornography, and I'm not here to define pornography. This is not a sociological expedition. I'm not going to try to define pornography for the purposes of this conversation. I think, well, actually, I think it was the Supreme Court who said, well, no, you know it when you see it, right? One of the members of the Supreme Court might have said that. Maybe it was somebody else. I'm not really sure. But in any case, we're generally talking about the depiction of graphic sex between humans, or at least one human, right? If it's National Geographic and they're showing, coyotes, I was going to say fucking, right? It sounds really dirty when you say that. That's the thing. Pornography is dirty, right? It seems dirty. It's still, even in 2022, it's still got a stigma attached to it. And perhaps it always will, as long as we continue to function in our puritanical mindsets. Victorian era mindset. I'm getting into, and it's going to start sounding like one of Ed Wood's articles, right? Puritanism, the enemy of free sexuality. Of course, Ed came onto the scene and started working in adult realms as the culture was vastly starting to change and things were starting to loosen up, and that freer expression of human sexuality was becoming a little bit more commonplace and tolerated. And there were some landmarks at the Supreme Court. Again, we'll go back to the Supreme Court, some landmark free speech decisions in the Supreme Court in the early 1960s. And by the end of the 1960s, a lot of folks are ready to really push the envelope in films, right? So when a lot of folks think about pornography, I think they think principally about film. But I'm going to be a little bit more inclusive in this conversation, say graphic depiction, a pornographic novel, perhaps an adult paperback. So across this wider spectrum of Ed's work in the adult industry, I want to pose the perhaps I think rhetorical question. The rhetorical question, and I said this in Ed Wood Wednesday's article on more than one occasion. Ed Wood is a porn pioneer, or is he a porn pioneer? I guess that's for you be the judge. I personally feel that yes, that's the case. I think a notion has obtained for a while with the Ed Wood fans who came to Ed Wood fandom via, the world's worst filmmaker sort of angle, right? The guy who made goofy sci-fi movies and with cheesy special effects, the Plan 9 sort of version of events. But that's realistically a mere half of his adult output. By the early 1960s, he's out of anything that would be construed as sort of mainstream work. And he's now working almost principally in sex work. He's a sex industry worker, not a performer, obviously, that we know of anyway, right? He does actually appear in a porn loop, but he doesn't perform in it. That would be kind of interesting, right? If Ed Wood were to actually, somebody finds an old porn movie and there's old Eddie, right, showing up in an actual porn movie. Many people who adhere to, that version of Ed that celebrates him for his kind of crackpot genius and for his outsider artistry. And totally legit. I totally agree with all that. That period of time actually is relatively well researched, right? I think we can agree that we know quite a bit about Ed's cohort when he was working in the 1950s and those films, etc. When we get into the 1960s and 70s, things become a little bit more nebulous. If not for a pioneering work, I suspect in this regard has got to be considered Nightmare of Ecstasy, because it opened a lot of people's eyes to the fact that Ed was more involved in pornography than I think most people knew at the time, back in the early 1990s. So a lot of people still clinging to that older version of Ed still are, I think, a little bit dismissive of his work in pornography, as if it was somehow less than or unimportant. And the notion being, and I think there's people quoted in Nightmare of Ecstasy, as a matter of fact, who said, Ed was really feeling like he was now slogging away in something that was he couldn't be proud of, that was really terrible. And I don't know, he did it for a long time and he had a tremendous output. So I'm not him. Can't speak to exactly where his head was at during that whole entire time frame. But let's wind it back a little bit and kind of go back to his presumed entree into the adult industry, so to speak. So what we do know, I guess we can start with what we know. We know that he publishes his first adult paperback. By the way, these are very quaint. These would be pornographic by a very loose standard, I guess. But nonetheless, they are at the time, they would have been considered, rather naughty depictions of human sexuality. So in any case, 1963's Black Lace Drag is what we know of as his first adult paperback, and subsequently re-released as, and better known today as, Killer and Drag. But that's 1963. Also, if you look, are of a regular viewer of the Summit podcast, if you were last year, you noticed that we did a couple of podcasts. Rob Huffman and I talked about, Ed's possible involvement in works for France Books and France magazines. We're going to get back to that subject, by the way, and that could actually predate Black Lace Drag, but don't know for sure. Not going to make that claim here. Nonetheless, we can certainly plot a line in the sand. 1963 writes what we know of as his first adult paperback for sure. There's no doubt about that. He writes just in the world of paperbacks. Of course, he's extremely prolific, far from the most prolific, right? There's some insanely prolific writers within the adult paperback space, people who I mentioned in an article recently at Ed Wood Wednesdays that, and it was James Pontilillo, the author of The Indispensable Unknown War of Ed Wood Jr., recommended, highly recommended. I recommend that every chance I can get. The full demystification of Ed Wood's war years via his entire war record, copiously annotated and very insightfully by by James Pontilillo. So get that book for sure. But going back. So where was I get on? This is how I get off on so many tangents. I was thinking this will be a nice quick podcast where I just kind of draw a little bit of a framework around Ed's work in various pieces of the adult industry and ask the perhaps rhetorical question: could Ed Wood be considered actually a porn pioneer? Anyway, I know where I was going with that. It was Jim who told me that mentioned to me author named Hugo Litwinski, Paul Hugo Litwinski, aka Paul Little, aka a whole ton of pseudonyms that I hadn't connected all those dots, and it was really eye-opening. But he wrote over 700 paperbacks, most of them adult paperbacks, the vast majority of them adult paperbacks, over 700. So what we know of as far as what Ed wrote, between the socio-sex paperbacks and the fiction paperbacks that he wrote, what are we in, like the 60, 70 range perhaps? And there's, talk and rumor about a handful of others beyond that. And as a matter of fact, as the year winds on, I think you're going to want to check in in a future, probably I'll do it as a podcast and reveal, I'll bring a few folks on with me to talk through that one to see if they agree, but reveal another unknown Ed Wood paperback. I say another because last year, of course, Joe Blevins and I discussed the Eros Gold Stripe paperback Sex Salvation by Raoul Woody, and agreed, and no one has disagreed with us thus far, that it was in fact Ed Wood's saving grace, a book noted in Nightmare of Ecstasy again. I talked to a few people about Sex Salvation back around the time, and one individual actually said, I really don't think Ed would have ever written anything this graphic. And there are very graphic scenes in Saving Grace. There's very graphic scenes in his short fiction, in his sex articles. So I kind of was like, well, the deeper you look, it's very clear, I think, that Ed did write extraordinarily graphic things, and certainly they became more graphic as the 70s wore on. So we'll get there, but right now we're backtracking a little bit through his paperback evolution. The paperbacks are quaint in the early 1960s by today's standards. They become a little bit more graphic and a little bit more revealing as the decade wears on. But as we get to the end of the 60s, they start to get incredibly graphic. And this is at the same time in the film industry, sex films are starting to get a little bit more graphic, where you have, nudie cuties, and now you have TNA. And then you get into the transition era films around 1970, transitions all the way obviously into hardcore pornography, literally by 1970. And so we'll get to the films in a moment. Going back to the paperbacks. So how many could there be, right? I don't know. I have done fishing expeditions here on the podcast, and many other episodes of fishing expeditions in my life over the course of the last roughly year and a half or so, and I have a feeling that there's a few others out there. I think I forget where it's mentioned, but Ed somewhere had mentioned upwards of 120 or 140 quote unquote books that he had written, or someone ascribed that to him. Again, don't quote me on the details. This one I'm just free forming off the top of my head. That's not the details are not the important point here. The important point is that he was a very prolific adult paperback writer over the course of literally the last 15 or 16 years of his life, from 1963 right up until the year of his passing, 1978. And he wrote TV Lust, the last known paperback, was published by Eros Gold Stripe also in 1977. But there's a item on his resume noting a book called Swedish House. It turns out, I'm very confident, it's not actually a book. It was a line of paperbacks. So, and they do line up with the time frame 1977, 78. So I have quite a few of the Swedish House paperbacks, written some articles about them back in the day. I think I have a developing viewpoint on that. So look for more of a deeper dive into the Swedish House line of paperbacks at some point down the road, to see which one, if he put it on his resume, are one of those books in that Swedish House line of paperbacks, or multiple books within that line of paperbacks. Could they have been written by Edward D. Wood Jr.? So the paperbacks, it was a burgeoning industry in the 1960s, and there was an literally insane amount of adult paperbacks published at the time. I'm always, hard pressed often when I read them, especially the early ones, thinking, did guys really read all the way through this? Did they feel like they were getting their money's worth? They got sold on probably a cover image of a, a woman in a state of undress, unclad in some form or fashion. And oh gosh, this has got to be the hot stuff, right? They're probably thinking to themselves, and then you start reading the book and you're like, this is like, I think Mickey Spillane has more sex than some of these supposed sex books, right? A Mickey Spillane paperback from the 50s. Oh, I don't know. I don't know what readers were thinking in the 1960s. It was a different era. I was born in 1968. How can I say? So I can't. I can only imagine. I can only imagine. There were literally, though, hundreds of probably different imprints, many imprints that sort of rolled up to a lot of the same editorial addresses. The mob was involved, obviously, fairly early on in the distribution, always throughout that time frame when Ed's working in the adult industry. The mob is really garnering control over it early on, and have by the 1970s pretty much entirely seized control of pornographic distribution in the United States. And matter of fact, well, all right, I'll get to that when I talk about the magazines. When we talk about Pendulum and we talk about Michael Thievis, actually, I'll transition from the paperbacks because there are paperbacks also published under the West Coast Pendulum imprint. Of course there are. We've talked about those previously on Ed Wood Wednesdays as well. So what else do I want to say about the paperbacks? It's not the most prolific, but he's a quite prolific paperback writer. I don't know how, again, tens and tens and tens of thousands of adult paperbacks were probably written and published from, roughly 1960, 61-ish through probably mainly through about 1983 or so. They still continued to be published, and probably is still a smattering of adult paperbacks being published today, but a smattering, not in anywhere near the sheer volume that was the overwhelming volume of paperbacks that were published during that media's heyday. Definitely, that was their heyday, the late 60s. Early 70s in particular, as things transitioned into much more graphic paperbacks, and Ed was there for it. And nobody's going to say that he wrote some of the classics of the genre. No one would say that necessarily about really any of the books, perhaps. I think you can evaluate, different authors based on their bodies of work and say, oh, this is a pretty interesting author. This is actually a fairly polished author. Hugo Litwinski actually is a very, very capable, extremely capable writer, more orthodox writer, certainly, than Ed. But he was there in a prominent way. There's no doubt about it. So that was a pioneering effort, because it was really the first time in human history where, to that degree, of course, sex books were being published prior to that. It would have been hard to get your hands on, though, not just off the wire rack in the back corner of the drugstore or something. You could presumably, back in the 1960s, they would have been fairly easy to obtain in that fashion, and fairly widely distributed. So it was this is a pejorative if I say it this way, the encroachment of adult pornography onto mainstream society. It encroached upon it somehow. I don't really think of it that way, but some do, certainly. Let's talk a little bit more about Pendulum. So Bernie Bloom, managing editor, I think worked in advertising as well for Golden State News. Golden State News, one of the biggest magazine, West Coast magazine distributors of its era in the middle late 60s, was really a principal distributor. And Bernie was working there, and he somehow, some way, decides to go off and get involved with his sort of own publishing company, but he ends up getting funded for that by a guy who was mob associated himself, and was at one point, in fact, he did end up doing time for, I believe, murder, arson, a few other things, but he was at one time on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. That's Michael Thievis, who started Pendulum Publishing actually in Atlanta in the earlier 60s, mid 60s, and started publishing sex books and magazines. And I presume that by 1968, Pendulum's West Coast operation, run by Bernie Bloom, was incorporated in. Actually, today's April 19th. I could be wrong on the date. Again, I'm going flying off the top of my head here, but it's in an old Edward Wednesdays. The incorporation date for the Pendulum West Coast office. For some reason, I have it in my head that it was actually April 18th of 1968. So sort of yesterday might have been the anniversary of that, and I missed it. Or in any case, spring of 1968, Pendulum's West Coast operation is incorporated. Bernie took, according to, again, Nightmare of Ecstasy, so much of the information that we still go upon in the world of woodology owes itself to all of the anecdotes that are collected by, different people that Rudy Gray talked to, and collected all those anecdotes together in Nightmare of Ecstasy. So we're obviously, any Ed Wood fan is indebted to that book for so many kernels of information. In some cases, we've been able to, based on those kernels of information, find out a lot more. And without that starting point, I don't know that woodology would still, at least in my viewpoint, still be going strong here in 2022. It's now 44 years, right? It's coming up on 44 years since Ed passed away, and still new things come to light quite frequently, and which is great, right? I think that's great, filling in a lot of the blanks. But the porn segment of his life, and that work that he did, I think, is probably the period that increasingly we know a little bit more about as time wears on. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself if I start talking about the films, but anyway, West Coast Pendulum starts publishing paperbacks and magazines as well, and I guess Ed is supposedly working at GSN. We know he had a number of his paperbacks distributed by GSN, especially some of his a number of Pad Library paperbacks under the imprint Pad Library, but distributed by Golden State News. So he's working there, at least as a paperback writer. I get the impression that he's probably writing magazine work there as well. And there is some evidence of that to a smattering degree, but the full extent of that, I think, is still an unknown, uncharted territory, and something that hopefully somebody, maybe something someday, I'll try to get into, start mining the GSN magazines circa 1966, 67, and see what comes up. I think in one of Tom Brinkman's indispensable Bad Mags volumes, and that again, highly recommended. And there's great information about Ed's magazine work in particular in those. I think he mentions that the first chapter of Bloodiest Sex Crimes in History was actually published in a GSN mag as a sort of standalone article. So could be one of the earlier magazine pieces that we know of that Ed published in an adult magazine, in a quote unquote pornographic magazine, right? So again, that's something I think warrants further study and research. Could he have been writing even earlier than that for France magazines, circa 1962, 63? Could he have been writing for GSN distributed magazines under, I don't know what imprint, a variety of imprints, even earlier than his Pendulum magazine work, which starts up, in earnest once Bernie starts really churning out the magazines in 1968, and the momentum builds from there to the point where we have, a real staggering number of magazines being published by Pendulum and sort of their sister brand Calga, and under some other imprints, Sex Press, SECS Press, as well as Edge of Sex. So think of them all as fundamentally the same. Of course, there's a little bit of an evolution there. Think of subsequently the magazines that don't carry an imprint but have the triple dot on them. Some people call them the triple ball magazines or the ball magazines. But if they have those triple dots on them, this is circa 1974, 75. By that point, actually, the next incorporation comes along, which is Gallery Press, same also Bloom run. And subsequently, after the run of triple dot magazines, we've got, and a lot of this we owe to Tom Brinkman's great research and the two Bad Mags volumes. So Swedish Erotica, of course, the behemoth megalithic porn company, Swedish, well, Caballero is what they ultimately incorporated as, but the brand Swedish Erotica, the brand itself, kicks off actually with porn loops. So, and that's fairly early on. We'll get to the loops and the films here momentarily, but let's go back to the magazines for a moment. So, and it's evident from what I mentioned earlier, if you look at the three volumes published in recent years that collect Ed's short fiction and articles largely from the Pendulum Calga magazines, you'll see what a staggering amount of work it is. And that's just really the tip of the iceberg. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of short stories and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles. There's pictorial texts, sometimes quite extensive, that comment upon photo features, and indexed across just a 3-year swath on his own resume in the early 70s, 716 of these pictorial texts that were minimally 1,500 words. He could have written shorter pieces beyond that. He wrote, and go back through, if you're really curious about this subject and you haven't been there, go back to some of the articles I wrote at Edward Wednesdays about writing editorials for the magazines, the adult magazines, perhaps writing captions for the photographs, writing a whole bunch of different a bunch of iterations of different kinds of texts. Sometimes you can pick up a Pendulum magazine, and whether there's credits to Ed or not, and whether it's things listed on his resume or not, you're just staring right down the barrel of an entire issue where every bit of the text seems like it had to have been generated by Ed. It was insanely prolific in the magazines, perhaps even more so than the adult paperbacks. Pendulum also published fiction paperbacks, but they also started, and they weren't the only one, but in 1969, a couple of different presses, inclusive of Pendulum, Erica Press, the East Coast Pendulum office actually had a series, the Psychomed series. The West Coast Pendulum office had a couple of different series. And again, go back to Edward Wednesdays, you can read more detail on that. You can go back to earlier podcasts where I talk about T.K. Peters, Dr. T.K. Peters, because they very often slapped Dr. T.K. Peters' name on the cover of a lot of this. I'm calling them socio-sex paperbacks. I'm not the one who first called them that, credit to whomever did. But what we're talking about in that case are books about a topic or a cluster of topics related to human sexuality. And they were envelope pushing in the sense that they had text on one page. They had text on one page, and on the facing page, there would have been a photograph. And they really started pushing the envelope as early as 1969 by, on these facing pages, often printing hardcore photographs. Think about that, right? 1969, a guy who maybe was a little bit older by that point, was probably like, oh my God, I lived long enough. I lived long enough finally to see, as a mass market commodity, actual hardcore pornography, images of hardcore pornography, where I could just pick them up again under the counter at the drugstore or at the local sex shop or wherever fine books are sold, I guess. So socio-sex paperbacks, Ed wrote a number of more than a dozen actually in that realm as well. So he's that's a pioneering effort in the sense that, again, hardcore images in books for people to marvel over, and pioneering effort in my mind. Again, no doubt, this is what I said earlier. I think I'm saying it rhetorically. Again, I totally understand people's viewpoint if they want to say, Greg, we don't really like to think of it that way. We prize Ed for the things he did prior to that, and when he got into the adult industry, the rest of it is really, it's not creative, it's not interesting to me, it's not something that I really want to know all that much more about. That's fine, right? Totally fine. So you probably turned this podcast off already, right? If you even started watching it, because I haven't uploaded this to YouTube yet. I have two ideas in my head. Do I call this one Ed Wood, Porn Pioneer? Well, 3 ideas: Ed Wood, Porn Pioneer, Ed Wood, Porn Pioneer with a question mark, or Ed Wood, Pornographer. Right? I think it would offend some Ed Wood fans, and I don't mean it that way, but I'm just trying to reckon with the reality of it in a full reckoning, full acknowledgement of all the work that Ed did. There ain't no way of getting around it. At the very least, no one can dispute just how prolific he was in these various adult media channels for that last 15 or 16 years of his life. No doubt about it. Whether or not he's a porn pioneer, again, he's there very early on and at some of these transitional points and some of these moments that are, from a sociological standpoint, these moments that are a socio-sexological standpoint, these moments that really were very society changing changes, real shifts in society, where all of a sudden, again, these things that were verboten for all of human history. Again, sex books existed prior to that, and there was always an underground. I'm sure there was. I think you could go back to there's cave drawings of people having sex and things like that. So it's always been around, but again, as a sort of mass market commodity that was easily obtainable for anybody who could afford it, that was over the age that was 18 or older. It was a game changer. So Ed's there, and he's quite prolific. So far, we've talked about him being prolific in adult paperbacks as well as magazines. So those are, again, two channels where the dissemination of pornography was quite immense. So he's prolifically working there right at key transitional points. So I think that meets my criteria for him having been a genuine pioneer of the adult industry. Pornographer, of course, makes it sound, and it's an accurate descriptor, but it sounds like a pejorative, right? It makes it sound like, oh, because it still does, again, has that sleazy association. You immediately think of, real sleazy types of people out to make a fast buck, exploiting probably the performers, certainly the women. I'm not going to get into the political arguments around it. I'm, again, just trying to assess from a very high level Ed's involvement in these industries. So you can certainly have your own personal feelings about pornography, and I'm sure you do. Everyone, I'm sure, does, and respect them all. So that's not what we're here to talk about. Let's see. Magazines, paperbacks. We'll get to film in just a moment, but I got them just as an example. This is not going to be one where we do a read through of a magazine, but I got a stack of Calga and Pendulum magazines in the mail about a week and a half ago for an insanely good price. I think I'm insanely patient waiting for good prices, and so I got a little stack of Calga and Pendulum magazines. All told, paid roughly about $10 an issue, which is pretty darn good price if you've looked into it, if you've bid on any magazines previously. And yeah, there's genuine Ed Wood in them, in at least a few of them, things that are credited to him or known to be written by him, listed on a resume, or just obviously him. A few other issues are more of a gambit on my part. This one is, I can show this. This is why I thought I'd show you one. And again, now I'm in a whole different setup here, and you're getting the glare again, but this one doesn't have nudity on the cover, so therefore I can show it to you. Can I show two women kissing on the cover here? Is YouTube going to have a problem with that? We'll find out. But this is Illustrated Case Histories, a study of lesbian practices. So just an example of a Calga socio-sex magazine, different than the themed magazines that had short stories in them and a couple of articles and a number of photo features. The socio-sex magazines generally just had a lot of articles about different sexual topics, very similar topics that were covered in the socio-sex paperbacks, as a matter of fact. And in a matter of fact, T.K. Peters' name is slapped around a little bit in the socio-sex paperbacks as well. So it's just one example of one of many titles that Pendulum / Calga / Gallery, with their couple of other imprints beyond that they published in the early 1970s. One of the things, and I can't show it to you obviously, but one of the things, the very first page I opened to, again, I'm going to get tempted to doing a fucking read through here very quickly, but just opening the first page, one of the things it reminds me of, because there's a I'm going to say it, a split beaver shot. So a split beaver shot. So it's fairly graphic, right? 10 years earlier, you wouldn't, even 5 years earlier, you wouldn't see that in a magazine. One thing that you see in a number of this, a primer for sexual education is one of the imprints. And I know for right off the top of my head, and I've seen issues of a primer for sexual education, hardcore photographic images. A lot of the Pendulum and Calga magazines that where the theme magazines were soft core. So they were still of the transition era where you would still see pickles and beaver. So you would see split beavers. The pickle, of course, you can imagine what that is. But what you wouldn't see was hardcore in the sense of erect penises and insertions and oral copulation graphically presented and et cetera, et cetera. Do I sound like a sexologist? Probably not. But anyway, this has just, a variety of files in it. So file number 1, dykes with dollars. I'm just going to look really, really quickly. I'm not even going to look at the text at this point. I still haven't really interrogated these issues entirely to the extent that I need to. I do know that some of them were obviously shot on, the photo features are often in all of these magazines shot on Hal Guthu's sets, the same sets where we find a lot of porn loops being shot, as well as a couple of feature films, Necromania and The Young Marrieds, hardcore pornographic films. Take It Out and Trade actually has some scenes shot at Guthu's place as well. That's a softcore film though. Things changed very quickly in 1970. So I'm just really curious, since I have it in my hand, to just look really, really quickly. Yeah, this is borderline hardcore. This is not merely split beaver, but it's all women, of course, because it is a study of lesbian practice. Here's an article, profile of a lesbian. Who is a lesbian? I'm totally going to end up, I'll be back in a future podcast to, autopsy a few example magazines here and there and kind of go through them. But I'm seeing, again, lots of split beaver here, but not really, it's not super graphic. I don't see, insertions. Oh, they have a jug of wine out in this picture. Three attractive young ladies. They get the jug of wine out. That's going to lead to undoubtedly debauchery of some kind. Oh, nice color centerfold there. Very nice. Then we have another file. Initiation of a lesbian. Men and women are a combination of each other. Men and women are a combination of each other. I'm going to be reading this later on tonight, catching up on this one. There's no doubt. So lots of photos in this, tons of photos. And they're very nice photos, actually, very sort of artfully shot. Garden of Youth, another article, actually, Garden of Youth. Some more photos. I think, high nude. I'm not making this up. He walked into a gunfight with an unloaded pistol. Jackrabbit Hollow, population 5. This doesn't have a credit on it, but I don't know off the top of my head, did Ed list this on a resume somewhere, but high nude, and it's NOOD, so haha, kind of funny, right? But nude, obviously evoking the notion of nudity. But this also, you're getting the point, right? It evokes a Western, the classic Western High Noon, which is why he spells it NOOD. He, I'm assuming, again, this is a he. I'm actually just on the basis of that alone, it being a Western story, that it's probably written by Ed Wood. There's a photograph, splash page next to the opening page text that is very consistent with the kind of line drawing you see, and it's not credited to anybody, but it's very consistent with the kind of line drawing you see in the splash pages accompanying the magazine short stories and articles throughout the Pendulum, Calga, let's call it Bloom, the Bloom family of magazines, right? The Bernie Bloom family of magazines. It's a very simple line drawing of a nude woman, but she's got a gun and a cowboy hat and cowboy boots on. So very nice, right? Basic black, so we get can imagine, get some not just white women in a study of lesbian practices. So it's looks like a fine issue. So just again, just to spin off of that, the magazines themselves, Ed's insanely prolific to a degree I don't even think that we know. I think we know that much of what he's written in the magazines, but and even a full accounting of it, I think is in process. I think there's not only, and me less so probably than a number of other people who've really taken to heart seriously collecting the adult magazines and really seriously trying to dig deeper and figure out what Ed may or may not have written. So there we have him writing for porn magazine. Again, this just one last point, the socio-sex magazines, actually, the evidence, at least superficially from my perspective, is that he wrote much less of the text in those magazines. I think, again, they need to be revisited from a more sort of unbiased lens. I kind of have that notion in my head, that bias for, whatever reason, not really based on a real serious study of a whole bunch of the magazines to really get a developed viewpoint. So again, he could have written prolifically across even the socio-sex magazines. He did write for them, obviously, quite often. So therefore, he's on the cusp of, writing on the cusp of hardcore imagery being introduced via magazine being injected into the bloodstream of society like a virus, right? I shouldn't even joke like that, right? I didn't mean to evoke that. I say a lot of stupid shit, right? But borderline offensive, perhaps, and I apologize if I offended anybody. But pioneering, is he pioneering? I think he is. He's so prolific. I think he's also pioneering in the sense what really constitutes men's magazines had been around by this point for a while, so pulpy kind of stories with some sex thrown in were kind of the thing. But one thing, and I mentioned Rob Huffman, who had joined me earlier on a talk at the Summit podcast about France books. Rob's got a book about Ed Wood where he makes a critical argument, and I think a really brilliant argument, that Ed was a very pioneer, sort of, I don't know if he used the word pioneering in it in retrospect, but pioneering in writing erotic fiction that has a horror bent to it. And I'll have to go one further, kind of almost like balls out in some cases. He's writing for sex magazines, really graphic sexual elements. As time wears on, they get more and more graphic, but also incredible amount of violence mixed with it often. And I think that really is pioneering. And I don't think actually anybody else really to as great a degree ever picked up the thread. You don't open a magazine from the 1980s, like an issue of Cherry or an issue of Chick or something like that, and go, oh yeah, the short story is about some, serial killer who did really awful violent things, and it's described like it's like a fucking Clive Barker book, like a book of blood, like a story in Clive Barker's books of blood, to be more precise. So splatter punk and that kind of thing, not even on the radar, doesn't even exist yet when Ed is writing very violent fiction for sex magazines. Kind of interesting, right? It's very different, and I think ahead of its time, perhaps isolated in time. Could have only happened then, in that time and place. So smoke, right? Again, don't adopt my bad habits. If it looks appealing, it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. Unfortunately, just take a pause and go off on a little tangent. I unfortunately started smoking, me and my friends, when we were teenagers, in our fairly early teens. And so by the time I was probably about, I don't know, maybe 15 or 16 years old, I was already, regularly smoking. And it's a habit that I've tried to break on. I've tried to quit on more than a handful of occasions, and utterly failed quite miserably. But I hope to one day pursue it strenuously and get past it. But I must confess I enjoy it. So there's that. We're flawed, right? We're flawed people. people are flawed, rather, humans just generally, right? Now I'm going to get into an evangelical argument about sin. Perhaps we all carry sin. I don't think is smoking a sin. I don't know. I can make an argument for that, right? So magazines, paperbacks, little quick end-to-end overview of his work in those veins, and I do think that it's qualifying of the moniker pornography. It's pornographic, and personally, again, pioneering. I feel pioneering. So whether you appreciate it or not, whether you want to just sort of not really think about that and think that's not my gig and that's not my bag and I don't really want to fucking know, Greg. I don't. And again, I would respect that. But then the films. So let's go on to the films. I mentioned the loops earlier. So Ed shows up, and again, it was in Nightmare of Ecstasy where it's mentioned a loop where Ed plays a jailer. Does not perform in it. And matter of fact, he shows up for mere seconds in the loop in a couple quick cuts, but it is absolutely him on set for a pornographic loop. One of the magazines I got, by the way, actually has a photo feature that I just got in that stack the other day, has a photo feature. And I'd seen some snips that somebody took with a cell phone from, and I didn't know what issue it was until I stumbled on it online a couple of weeks ago. But somebody had, a friend of mine had sent me a few cell phone snips of a couple of the pages of the photo feature, Prisoner of Love, or it might be Prisoners of Love. But it's shot right on the same exact set as Prisoner's Lovemaking the Loop. The iron grate is there, the paneled, the fake brick wall paneling, the little sign, Prisoner's Lovemaking, 10 minutes. The guy in the photo feature wears the same costume as the guy in the loop. I think it's a different guy though. It's a guy and two girls in the photo feature. Ed does not appear in the photo feature, but the text commentary does have a ring that sounds very much like Ed. The funny thing about it is, and this is why I think where Ed could be quite irreverent, he often sings his own praises in reviewing his own film or literary work, but he doesn't always. And in this particular case, he actually sort of knocks the jailer loop in it, I think, in a way, because he talks about the photo feature portrays itself as if this is the loop. It's this threesome. Again, the loop, if that loop exists, I've never seen it. I think he's talking about the loop that was shot, that he was present for, that he was probably the director of on that same set, the Prisoner's Lovemaking loop. So in the article, though, Prisoner of Love, he talks about, we didn't really have the opportunity to go to the extent that we wanted in, grappling with the issue of conjugal visits. So he's saying, I wanted to make a serious movie about conjugal visits, but unfortunately they just forced our hand to just shoot just plain old sex. So he knocks the Prisoner's Lovemaking loop, I believe, in that particular article. You'll see that article I think in an upcoming item, I guess is what I'm going to say. I don't want to quite reveal yet what that is in particular, something that me and a few other folks are working on, and I think something that's going to be very exciting for Ed Wood fans who are interested in this particular period of his work, his quote unquote pornography. The loops, go back to the loops. So it's also in Nightmare of Ecstasy where somebody mentions that Ed was paid to write subtitles for silent 8mm films made by quote unquote Swedish erotica, is what it says in Nightmare of Ecstasy. That turns out to be true. There are actually loop series even prior to that shot on the same Hal Guthu sets. There's a fantastic article, and I'll leave the subject to Joe Blevins on the Ed Wood Wednesdays blog, an article Joe wrote that was really influential to me to dive into the loops to the extent that I have over the last 5 years or so of my life. But he overviews the first 19 Swedish erotica loops, which are all subtitled, often shot on those same sets as Necromania and the Young Marrieds, with a lot of the same set decorations, and often sort of considered the core of Ed's work in loopdom. Right? If you go to Ed Wood Wednesdays and you look at some of the articles I wrote about other loops for other series and on other labels, I think it's tip of the iceberg. And matter of fact, the subtitles continue being produced for the Swedish erotica loops far past episode 19. They go into, I think close to, 150 episodes deep, right up until 1978, around the time of Ed's death. Was he the only one writing those subtitles all along the way? There's a high degree of consistency to them. Either way, I think we get that kernel of information that he was a part of it from Nightmare of Ecstasy. We can assume that. We can also, via just a very superficial textual analysis, if you read enough of Ed's work generally, you can see clues that suggest that, yeah, this sounds like it was Ed who was often, if not always, writing these loop subtitles. There's a conjecture that I think I've made on numerous occasions at Ed Wood Wednesdays, and I still feel that's the case. As time wore on, could other people have cobbled together the subtitles for the loops? Perhaps. I don't know, but I know that he did do it. I believe, and I think he did it at a high volume for a fairly lengthy period of time, certainly in the early half of the 70s, around the time the Swedish erotica brand was really getting off the ground and the loop series was getting off the ground. You have all these other loop series like Garter Girls and subtitled loop series, Garter Girls, Pussycats, many others. Again, you can find examples of Danish international films. You can find examples of many of those loops with the subtitles actually transcribed over at Ed Wood Wednesdays. So, which is on the Dead to Rights blog, D2R d2rights.blogspot.com. I always struggle with that, but Joe Blevins is highly recommended blog, covers on a lot of different aspects of pop culture, sort of niche culture, interesting things, all kinds of interesting things. But for you as an Ed Wood fan, if you have to already know about Ed Wood Wednesdays, because Joe did such a mountain of work over there, and I've been, felt privileged to contribute to it, articles of my own over the course of the last 5 years. But the subject of the loops has fascinated me, trying to piece it all together and trying to figure out exactly what level of involvement Ed had. Did he commonly direct? Did he edit the loops, perhaps? To what extent? How long before someone else took the reins? All of that. That's all a fascinating subject to me, and one that I've spent a lot of time working on. And so you'll see certainly more articles and perhaps more podcasts talking about that subject. So is that pioneering work, right? Working in 8mm sex shorts. They'd been around, of course. Probably the earliest sex films that were ever made were probably made before the beginning of the 19th century, right? As soon as film started to, as soon as it was made, somebody probably started to say, hey, let's shoot some people having sex, right? Again, it would have been hard to obtain and it was all surreptitious, but I think it's fair to say it remains that way by and large. Again, you've got stag films, right? You could go to a smoker, at the lodge, and you and the guys could watch an 8mm film, or even a 16mm film in some cases, like burlesque films and things like that, through the 50s, and sometimes outright hardcore sex films would be passed along in these circles as well, and other again surreptitious venues. But now you could buy the loop, right? You could buy the loop, and it's hardcore pornography. This is by 1970-71 timeframe. I think the earliest copyright I've seen on one of the Swedish erotica loops, I saw a box with a 1972 copyright for the first episode of Virgin Next Door. And I think there were series that preceded it in 1971. So well, it's not Pendulum, it's actually Noel Bloom, Bernie Bloom's son, Cinema Classics, as a loose sort of overarching company for all these various film series and loop series. But they're making loops certainly by 1971 at a fairly high volume, and that's really 1971 is ground zero for hardcore porn visually on film. I think 1970 it makes its breakthrough. I think Mona was released to theaters as the first hardcore feature film, often considered that. That had, penetrated no pun intended, penetrated the mainstream society in late 1970. But then 1971 is when hardcore porn just sort of explodes upon the world, leading to ultimately, the sort of high water mark, the moment when some people, I think, probably believed hardcore porn is going to break through and just become a mainstream entity. That really didn't happen. It got pushed back down, got pushed back into the back alleys and back into the sex shops. But I'm speaking, of course, of Deep Throat, which became, I think it was the 4th highest grossing film at the box office that year. Not porn film, the 4th highest grossing American film at the US box office in 1972. It could have been even higher. It might have been the highest grossing film. Somehow the 4th is in my head. Devil and Miss Jones, Gerard Damiano's subsequent hardcore film, also was a huge box office success. But the ship sailed relatively quickly on that. Hardcore porn still remained extremely popular and extremely profitable, certainly, but the average couple going out on date night was not going to see films like that in the 1970s as they would have gone to see perhaps Deep Throat, because it became a cultural phenomenon. So necromania, let's talk about, so we talked about the loops a little bit, but Ed's again involved, and I think the loops are pioneering in that they get the pornography right into people's homes, right? You can take this loop home, you can play it on a projector in the privacy of your own home. You can buy porn and now filmed porn. You don't have to go to some underground venue. You can collect it yourself and watch it whenever the fuck you want to watch it, right? So I think that's game changing too, and a real pioneering, media to disseminate hardcore pornography. So feature films, again, 1971 for both loops to a degree, and even more so feature films is the year when the feature films just flood the market. Of course, a lot of low budget films, one day wonders, 55 minutes long, not uncommon. And in fact, Necromania sort of fits that bill. I'm not sure how many, I think I've seen that maybe there was a 3-day shoot for Necromania. Perhaps not quite, right? I think it could have been shot quite quickly, and in the space of a day is not unthinkable to me. Same with The Young Marrieds, the subsequent feature film, hardcore feature film, written and directed by Ed Wood. So there could be more out there. Think about this for a second. Nightmare of Ecstasy does not mention The Young Marrieds. Said, I presume, had not gotten onto Rudolph Gray's radar yet at that point. It's just no one knows, right? No one, Ed's not mentioned it anywhere. It's just, but then it turns up, and there it is, right? Directed by Dick Trent, and light bulbs go off. And Dimitri Sotis, my friend Dimitri, was one of the first people to really take note of that. He had a print of the film at a time when the film had seemed to have disappeared, but then a few prints started to pop up and appear in different places along the way, subsequently in the last decade or so, or a little more than a decade. And although we don't have documentary evidence per se that Ed was involved in The Young Marrieds, it's impossible to think otherwise if you really study the evidence. And so I'll say confidently that's a movie that Ed Wood wrote and very likely directed. I can't imagine otherwise, quite frankly. So those are the 2 hardcore feature films that he makes, and Necromania and then The Young Marrieds. Young Marrieds comes out with the credited year 1972. I think it was shot sometime in mid-October. This is the most I can pin it down, sometime in mid-October of 1971. Necromania was shot prior to that, but Necromania is definitely hits the market long before, not long before, but significantly before Deep Throat. And so again, is Ed pioneering? He's among that initial wave of filmmakers who inserted hardcore sex into their feature films, and they were shown in theaters, and you could go buy a ticket and sit down in the theater, watch people on a big screen having sex, hardcore sex. So pioneer, is he a pioneer, being a pioneering director of porn? Just a couple of films. There's of course, I've mentioned Damiano. There's a lot of other prolific directors in those early days of the hardcore film industry, and many, I think a lot of people would say, who are far more accomplished filmmakers than Ed Wood was. But I guess as an Ed Wood fan, I happen to have a big a big soft spot for both Necromania and the Young Marys. And matter of fact, I think I mentioned this a while back, but Joe Blevins again had sent me one day, or he'd mentioned it somewhere, and I saw it. He said he was playing around with just this little online tool called a preference revealer, and it's simple. I'm sure it's a pretty simple algorithm to put together, but you take a number of items and just one by one, it says, do you, if let's say let's say the number of items are A to Z. Do you prefer A to B or B? And then you say A. Do you prefer B or C? C. And you go through the whole entire alphabet, and then it spits back out a list of your preferences, what you like best. So I did this with Ed Wood's movies at the time, and my recollection is that Glen or Glenda came up as my favorite Ed Wood movie, but the Young Marys actually came up next, and Necromania was quite high on the list as well. So yeah, I think they're very fun, interesting films, and I think you'll see that we're going to talk in greater detail about both of them in an item in the future. So no Criswell pun intended. So that's, again, pretty quick, well, near hour long probably, overview of Ed's general involvement in the adult industry over that span of time, the latter part of his life. And I guess it's a sad period in his life from what we understand, right? His alcoholism, progressive disease, he's becoming increasingly sick, to the point where he dies at the mere age of 54. I just turned 54 actually a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. So that's kind of interesting. But he's economically struggling. We presume, getting kicked out of places for lack of paying the rent, and in a tumultuous, I think it's fair to say, a tumultuous relationship with Kathy Wood. That's depicted rather starkly in some of the stories that people told to Rudy Gray that are, again, included in Nightmare of Ecstasy. I didn't say I recommend Nightmare of Ecstasy. If you're still watching this, you have read Nightmare of Ecstasy, I'm sure, many times over. As probably even people who aren't really all that interested in Ed's porn work are, I'm sure, highly familiar with Nightmare of Ecstasy as a foundational book of woodology, perhaps one of the most foundational stones of that endeavor, no doubt about it, as a matter of fact, in my mind. So again, quick overview. So I haven't been here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast in a few months, and now that Joe has completed his reviews of all the articles in the articles collection compendium, When the Topic is Sex, put out by Bear Manor Press. So yeah, highly recommend go out and buy that if you haven't already. But every day, 88 days straight, Joe shared with us another review of another article. Heroic work to stick with so consistently over the long haul, and a real mountain of work, and a highly recommend you check all of that out as well if you haven't already. So go to Ed Wood Wednesdays and check that out, and pick around Ed Wood Wednesdays generally and see. I think you'll find something, regardless of sort of how you came to Ed or how Ed came to you. I think you'll find content there if you haven't been there or haven't gone deeply into the site or into that portion of the Dead to Rights blog, the Ed Wood Wednesdays portion, that you'll find a lot of stuff that's pretty interesting if you're a serious Ed Wood fan. Even if you're a casual Ed Wood fan, I think you might find some things that might really make you sit up and take notice and want to dig and delve a little bit deeper. So it's pretty much all I wanted to talk about today. I think I covered what I wanted to talk about. So in the future, again, I'm not trying to sound like Criswell, future episodes of the Summit podcast, just to give you a sense, I want to be back with greater regularity from this point forward in 2022. We are going to talk about a wide variety of subjects. We're going to talk more again about the France books and magazines, I believe. We will probably at some point be revisiting the Frank Leahy Legend screenplay. You'll see. Again, I'll leave that one for a little bit of leave you with a little bit of intrigue around that. We're going to inevitably talk more about I'm sure, other paperbacks, inclusive of potentially revealing one or two, or maybe more, unknown. Well, they are known, right? If I'm saying it, and a few other people I know, a few other people actually, I don't want to get into too many details. That's not fair of me to say. If other people perhaps have made some discoveries, but hopefully we'll reveal them here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. As always, I hope you found this enjoyable. I hope you found some good food for thought. You found this beneficial, and join us again in the future here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. And I hope I'll see you back here sooner than later. Thank you. Have a great, I was going to say night. I don't know what time it is where you're at. Have a great time, everybody.